My name is Christiane Püker. I'm the director of the German-American Center in Stuttgart, a cultural and educational institution focusing on the United States and the transatlantic relationships. I may also welcome you on behalf of the collaborating German-American centers in Freiburg, in Heidelberg, Kaiserslautern, Kiel, Leipzig, München, Nuremberg, and Tübingen. Colleagues, thank you so much for cooperating. This evening is a part of a GAC series of events called End of the Transatlantic Dream, ? A series we designed last year. Now, it will be very interesting to follow how relations develop under Joe Biden's presidency, especially with President Biden having already taken several steps to intensify international and transatlantic dialogue again. In January, the series was launched by the German-American Center Freiburg with economist and Nobel Prize winner Professor Dr. Joseph Stiglitz. Today, I have the honor and pleasure to welcome the former US Ambassador to Berlin, John B. Emerson. Many thanks to you, Mr. Ambassador, for taking the time to joining us. It is truly a pleasure to see you again. Ambassador Emerson will talk about and share his experiences and his expertise in the field of transatlantic diplomatic service, giving us insights into the remarkable power of diplomacy and maybe also into its limitations. Marion Damseisen, the cultural program manager of the German-American Center Stuttgart, who has worked with Ambassador Emerson during his time in Berlin, will now have the pleasure to introduce him shortly and afterwards interview our guest for approximately 40 minutes. Please let me add that already during the talk, you can use the Q&A or Frage und Antwort button to type in questions, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible after the talk. This button you can see on your screen at the bottom edge. If you feel more comfortable asking the question in German, you can do so, and we will translate them. Please note that the chat function will be disabled throughout this event, and you will not be able to turn on your mic or your camera. In this regard, we will be a little bit like Fort Knox due to German data privacy regulations. And now, Ambassador Emerson, Marion, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Christiane, for this wonderful introduction, and welcome, John. It's so good to see you after such a long time. I will only say a very few words so we can start the conversation and get to many questions. Most people already know who you are. They know that you've been our ambassador here from 2013 to 2017. But what a lot of people may not know, and so I still wanted to mention it, is that you remained closely entangled in the transatlantic partnership. You currently serve as chairman of the American Council on Germany, the German Marshall Fund, and the American Friends of the Munich Security Conference. But also on a more personal note, you and your family have now built a second home, so to speak, in Berlin, Charlottenburg. And you keep this relationship, and it's, I guess, fair to say that you are still very much interested in Germany and in this partnership. And we are so glad that you're here today, joining us from Los Angeles due to COVID, not from Berlin. And yeah, as Christiane said, today we're going to talk about the power of diplomacy. And so we want to cover a bit your time as ambassador to Germany. We want to talk also about, of course, the transatlantic partnership, what happened after you left, the 4 years after you left, but also look a little bit into the future and see, you know, what can we expect from the Biden administration. And so in the light of all that, I want to start with a very general question. How does one become US ambassador to Germany? And if I may ask, how did you become ambassador?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Marian, for that introduction, and not just for the introduction, but for being such an important part of our family and our lives when Kimberly and I were in Berlin with our three daughters for that almost 4-year period of time. And Christiana, I want to thank you for welcoming us, for putting this all together, and the German-American Center for all the work you do. As you were ticking off the cities and the regions of Germany that you represent and that are represented with participants in this call. I must say these are some of our favorite places in Germany. And I also notice on the participant list that that my wife, Kimberly Marteau Emerson, who's also involved in a number of transatlantic organizations still, even after we've left, is on the call. So I want to welcome her as well. And Marianne's waving. So how did I become an ambassador? How does one become an ambassador? It's interesting. In the United States, typically we have 70% of our ambassadors to other countries, bilateral ambassadors, are career foreign service officers. Now, in a country like Germany, I would say 95% of the ambassadors are career foreign service officers. So, and that is typical. So that's the fact that we now have 30% of ambassadors who are not career foreign service officers is rather unique to the United States. And who are those people? They generally tend to be people who are close to the president. They're close to the president. They're close to senior administration officials. They typically have a connection to the country to which they are posted. And while they don't come out of the career foreign service professionals, they're actually the only non-career person in the embassy. So, and the advantage of having a non-career ambassador to some places is that there is a direct personal relationship into the White House with other cabinet members that often the career foreign service officers don't have. So, so that's what happens. In the way, typically what happens at the beginning of a presidential administration. So this process is ongoing with President Biden right now. The administration will look at, first of all, there's a discussion between the State Department and the White House about which ambassadors should be career, which ambassadors should be non-career. Sometimes that changes. And then there is a sort of a selection process where the White House in general will look at people that they think would make sense to serve in that country. It's often people who have been very involved in the campaign, but as I said, people who also have credibility with the country to which they're posted. And what happened to me was I had known Barack Obama since 2003 when he was first running for the Senate, had been, even though Kimberly and I were supporters of Hillary Clinton in 2008 when Obama first ran, is once she left the campaign, we began supporting Barack Obama. I was his actually chairperson in California for the first 4 years of his presidency. And shortly before the election, I received a phone call from his staff saying, if we're successful in him getting reelected, this was 2012, would you be interested in serving as ambassador? And I said, well, it depends on where it is. And they said, well, why don't you put together a list? And honestly, I put together a very short list, and Germany was at the top of the list. And the reason was I have German roots, as does Kimberly. So we have strong family ties to Germany. I took, even though you wouldn't notice because my German is not so good, aber ich kann Deutsch besser verstehen als sprechen. I took German in high school and in college, in part because of those German roots. I knew that as we were coming out of the global financial crisis at that time, still coming out of the global financial crisis, that the business and economic relationship between Germany and the United States would be very, very critical. And I was part of an international, a global investment firm. So I'd had some exposure to that and to already some of the international economics that we thought would be a factor. I had been a senior White House official for Bill Clinton in the Clinton administration, and in that capacity was involved in some of our trade policies and trade negotiations. And I knew that TTIP was going to be a very strong and important issue for the Obama administration in the second term. And then I basically got lucky, and lucky in the sense that that the president and the White House staff selected me. And so anyway, that's kind of what happened, and it ended up being an extraordinary experience. What's interesting about it, though, is I think I was selected more for my understanding of business and the economy than I was for national security. I really had not had much national security expertise. But interestingly enough, I would say 40 to 50% of what the job became was focused on national security, because we had so many issues involving the intelligence community, involving the Russian incursion in Ukraine and illegal annexation of Crimea, involving the refugee crisis, involving the rise of terrorism in Europe. And so as ambassadors, you want to pick people who have perhaps the judgment and flexibility to be able to handle whatever comes at you, because honestly, it's impossible to predict really what the job may entail once you actually get to post.
All right. I think this is the first time I heard this in depth, this analysis of what actually happened. Super interesting. And you already commented on your German roots. I just wanted to ask as a follow-up maybe, when you were sent to Germany, and I know that you talked about TTIP, you mentioned that already, but did you have an agenda? Did you have like certain goals that you wanted to accomplish? And maybe also, how do you feel, have you been successful in doing so?
Well, you know, the most important thing, I think, for any bilateral ambassador is to work hard to strengthen the ties and the relationship between the two countries. And that has several components to it. Yes, one aspect of it is pursuing and advocating for the goals and objectives of the administration. TTIP would obviously be an example with that. It happened to be a shared goal that President Obama had with Angela Merkel, Chancellor Merkel, to get TTIP negotiated. We ultimately did not succeed in that. We came close, but did not succeed. But and there are other issues that you agree on that maybe you disagree on, where you work with the host country to try to get that done. But the much broader and more important part of the job is really the public diplomacy aspect of the job, where what you're trying to do is build a deeper and more profound understanding back in the United States of Germany and Germans, and in Germany of the United States and Americans. So I always used to emphasize that as ambassador, you are the personal representative of the President of the United States. Yes, that's true, but you are really the representative of the United States of America. And that includes Democrats, Republicans, people who aren't involved in politics at all. It includes business, it includes arts, it includes culture. It's much broad. It includes historical connections. It's much broader than that. So that's sort of the second part of the job, is representing the entirety of the United States. The third part of the job is understanding the host nation, understanding Germany, understanding, and then trying to communicate that back to the policymakers in Washington. And so that they, when they're adopting policy, it's policies that that are going to make sense with regard to the bilateral relationship. And that is, as you know, Marion, I mean, Kimberly and I spend an enormous amount of time, probably 2 to 3 days a week, traveling outside of Berlin and building ties and getting to know folks throughout Germany. And that also is a very, very important part of the job. So I guess if you say, what was my fundamental goal and objective? It was to leave my post with a much deeper and stronger and more profound tie between the United States and Germany than what I found when I arrived. And then beyond that, it was to try to work on addressing issues that came up, but also building and deepening the working relationship between, Germany and the United States on every level, on the people-to-people level, on the business-to-business level, and for sure on the government-to-government level. And as you may recall, we started out with a little bit of a speed bump.
Yeah, actually, now that you mention it, I can ask my follow-up question, because I guess what I was trying to ask is that in every kind of friendship and every kind of partnership, there are also complications. And so you're already hinting at it, but what would you say was one of the biggest challenges, or were there different challenges that you had to face? And then how did you deal with them?
Well, the big obvious one, which most people will remember this, they may not remember I was the ambassador when it happened, because we also had WikiLeaks and all that. But at the time when I went through my confirmation process and our family all came to Germany, the NSA, the Snowden disclosures were very much in the front of the news. And about 6 weeks after arriving, I received a phone call from Christoph Heusgen, who is now one of our dearest friends. He was the national security advisor to the chancellor. He is currently the German ambassador to the UN, saying, "I'm going to send you a document. I trust you will tell me it's a forgery, but you need to know that the chancellor's personal private cell phone number is on that document." And the document appeared to be an NSA tasking memo, which would have suggested that the United States government was listening to the chancellor's cell phone. And this created an explosion that was known, of course, in the German press as Handygate. And so immediately we had to deal with a crisis of trust, a crisis of confidence. I don't think I need to remind people of how upset and concerned the German people were about this, particularly a country that had 50 years of dealing with the Third Reich and the Stasi, using intelligence gathering as a way of oppressing and controlling the populace. This was a big deal. So part of my job, the fundamental part of my job, was how do you get out there and try to rebuild trust? And as we know, in a personal relationship and in a political relationship, it takes a very long time to rebuild trust once it has been violated. So that was the kind of a big long-term piece. And by the way, when you asked the question of what was I most proud of, I think it was at the time we left, yes, we had really succeeded in rebuilding trust. But the second thing was also rebuilding the working relationship between our intelligence community and the German intelligence community, and rebuilding the working relationship between at all levels of government. But the other part was trying to get the government in the United States to understand how serious an issue this was. So I immediately called Susan Rice, who was the national security advisor for Barack Obama, for President Obama at the time, and said, we have got to say, the president has got to say that we do not and will not be monitoring the communications of the chancellor. And he did one better. He said, we do not and will not be monitoring the communications of the heads of state and heads of government of our friends and allies. But of course, that left a big open question about, well, what on earth have you guys been doing? Which, for a variety of reasons, is not a question that an ambassador can really engage directly. And the State Department sent me a cable, and the cable said, what you need to do is say, I'm sorry, we don't comment on intelligence matters. And I promptly ripped it up. And by the way, this is a reason why it's good sometimes to have a non-career ambassador who has a much better sense, perhaps, of what the president would want him to do than someone who's worried about annoying or violating a directive from the State Department. And the reason I ripped it up was because I knew that would not be the way to begin to rebuild trust. When you had editorials and you had headlines saying, are we no longer friends? Are we only partners? Has trust been destroyed? On and on and on. And so what I did was engaged in first initially in Germany, in Berlin, with the press, and then literally I'd say almost a 6-month tour of the country. And part of this was my introductory tour anyway, because we'd just gotten there, addressing the issue, letting people express their concern, upset, why they were concerned, reflecting back that I fully understood that, and then trying to evolve the conversation into a broader discussion about, number one, what changes we were making, but number two, how important our continued and shared intelligence work was. And honestly, that was helped a little bit when about 9-10 months later, we had the tragedy of terrorism, once again, raising its head on European shores with the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris. But that was that process, and this is such an important part of diplomacy. It's getting out and meeting with people, large groups with people, or smaller groups with opinion leaders and influencers, and allowing them to express their concern and expressing back that you understood that concern, and then trying to move the conversation to a place where you could actually make progress together and grow together.
All right. If I may, I would like to stay a little bit on diplomacy in general. On February 4th, President Biden addressed the members of the State Department. And in his speech, he emphasized that diplomacy was back, and that the people working for the State Department were the face of America abroad. That's a quote. And he made it very clear that he wanted for all of them to rebuild these alliances that may have been neglected over the past 4 years. So after 4 years of a US president who has often led us to believe that business is more crucial than diplomacy and that deals are more important than relationships, where do you think lies the power of diplomacy in these days?
Well, it's important to understand the theory of the case for Donald Trump and what this America First, which really became America withdrawing from a leadership role in the world, and America withdrawing even from the idea that our alliances are one of our greatest assets that we have globally, was a very sharp departure from what had been a 40 to 50 year bipartisan consensus. You can go all the way back to even the Nixon administration or even before that, but Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Obama, Bush, bipartisan consensus that one of the strongest assets the United States of America has is our alliances. And one of the most valuable resources we have are the multilateral institutions that were created in the wake of the Second World War and fundamentally created the foundation for peace and prosperity, not just in Europe, but transatlantically and even in parts of Asia. And the Trump approach was a very sharp departure from that. And the theory of his case was, we're the 800-pound gorilla, the United States of America, and we don't want to be constrained by worrying about what our allies think or what our allies want to do. We don't want to be constrained by the rules of and the slow pace of movement through these multilateral institutions, like the UN or the WTO or the Paris COP21, the climate change agreement, or the JCPOA with Iran, any number of agreements. So it ended up canceling agreements, pulling out of groups and organizations. And at the end of the day, with Joe Biden coming in, we have seen a return of the philosophy that our alliances and our engagement in these multilateral institutions is in fact what makes us stronger. And a recognition that the global challenges that we face, whether it's climate change, transnational terrorism, the refugee crisis, which is only going to grow more severe with climate, nuclear proliferation, all those issues are much better handled together than just with the United States handling them by themselves. And that is a message that I think New Secretary of State Tony Blinken made clear in his confirmation hearings, and it's a message that President Joe Biden made very, very clear in his statement or his speech to the State Department employees, and then more broadly to the rest of the world. That doesn't mean that these institutions aren't in need of reform. What it means is we need to take a leadership role in trying to reform them, and we need to work with our allies in order to do that. And so that's sort of a return, not to exactly the way things were, because there will be this focus on reform of organizations like the World Health Organization, the WTO, the different aspects of the UN, but we are getting engaged again in those organizations, and that I think is going to be a key difference. And to your question about, can you do that? I think it's important to remember that from a diplomatic standpoint, and from the standpoint of how Germany feels about the US or US feels about Germany, we've had a lot of ups and downs. During the Cold War, there were demonstrations in the streets in Germany against the sighting of Pershing missiles on European soil, nuclear weapons. That was a huge issue. During the Bush administration, there were real concerns about the Iraq War and Abu Ghraib, and there was the governments were at loggerhead, and there were a lot of protests there with that. We had WikiLeaks, we had Handygate, and in every instance, we were able to recover from that and rebuild from that. I do think, with the American Council on Germany, we did a poll with our sister organization, Atlantic Brücke, on Germans, Americans, and Americans' attitudes to one another. And interestingly enough, Americans have a great and very positive attitude towards Germany. 85%, it's one of their favorite countries. Angela Merkel is probably the most recognized and respected foreign leader, maybe secondly recognized to Putin, but certainly the most respected foreign leader the United States have. People feel good about Germany. You want to sell products, you talk about German engineering, you're going to sell those products in America. And yet in Germany, 80% of the Germans felt the relationship with the United States was bad. And the reason is that was, of course, a reflection of the response to the Trump administration, which was marked not by consultation and cooperation and coordination and collaboration, but by bullying and policy making by tweet. And, where Angela Merkel had to learn on tweet that in last March that we were banning flights from Europe or banning European citizens from coming to the United States, or Angela Merkel had to learn by tweet that we were going to be withdrawing troops from German soil, something that Joe Biden just reversed 2 days ago. That kind of behavior really set our relationship and the attitude that a lot of Germans have toward the United States down. I do think that can be rebuilt, but I think there will be one nagging question, which is, this happened once, can it happen again? And honestly, it's going to take some time, I think, for us to get past that as well.
Yeah, and I also think that a lot of people were looking for the U.S. ambassador to Germany that came after you for guidance. It took some time. There was this period where there was no ambassador at all. Then we had the ambassador that was, sometimes described as toxic or irritating or isolated. So very different from what you've described. And so I guess people will also look, you can correct me, to the next ambassador that's going to come. And so a lot of questions that I have received, and so I think I just want to forward it to you, is when do you expect the next person to arrive? And also, I guess, what kind of person do you think Germany needs at the moment?
Well, I think it'll be someone who, and obviously I don't know, it's going to be the president's decision, but I think it'll be somebody who has a background and understanding in certainly about Germany, not someone who has no ties or connections or, from a policy standpoint, no knowledge of our relationship. Hopefully, for sure, it'll be someone who will be carrying the message of the Biden administration that we're back, we're engaged, we want to be partners, we want to be collaborators. I would trust it would be someone who will, and I have no idea who it might be. I have every expectation that whomever it is, that Kimberly and I will be visiting with them before they come, and we'll talk to them about that. We'll bring the energy to get around the country and to understand that, Germany isn't, it's not like some countries where it all comes from the capital, but Germany has multiple points of influence that, and you need a lot of energy to kind of get out there and do that, and to talk to people and to listen. People, I had to stop saying this after Handygate, but at the beginning, people say, what's the most important quality for an ambassador to have? I'd say to be a good listener. Of course, after Handygate, they'd say, well, I guess you're doing that a lot. So I had to change that, but it's true. And so that needs to be a qualification. And I have no doubt that whomever President Biden picks will hit those kinds of qualifications and bring a sort of "we're back" message to Germany and to the German people.
And how long do you think it's going to take?
Oh, yeah, good question. I'm sorry, I forgot that part of your question. Well, just to level set, it takes a while. I mean, I was the first ambassador of Barack Obama's second term. Now, don't forget, he didn't have to set up his entire government. He was already in place. They made some changes, so it was a faster process. First ambassador of Obama's second term to get to post, and Kimberly and I and our daughters arrived on August 15th. So they're going through a process of making their decisions and selection. That probably won't be done till mid to late March, would be my guess, if passed as prologue. And then there's no announcements made. That's just when people get the phone call saying, are you willing to be vetted to be the ambassador to X, Y, or Z country? Then they have to go through all the background checks because you have to get the highest level security clearance and all that. So they want to know all the times you traveled overseas, who do you keep in touch with, all your neighbors, where did you go to school? And literally and sometimes it's the FBI, sometimes it's for State Department positions, it's diplomatic security. They literally go out and talk to people and interview them and put together a report. And then if there are questions or concerns that come up, they come back to you with that. Then there's the financial aspect of it. They want to make sure that you're, and this is much more of an issue for non-career ambassadors than it is for career foreign service, for obvious reasons. They're people that come out of the business community. They may have business interests in that country, and the ethics people in the government say you have to divest yourself of those business interests. And sometimes the person will say, no, I can't do that. That's, we have too many co-investors. It would destroy the investment. And then they don't get to be ambassador. Or they say, okay, I'm willing to do that. That process takes a long time. Once that's done and the White House vets you, then they go to the country and they ask for agrément. Agrément is the process where they would say to the head, usually it's the head of state, not the head of government, are you okay if we send X over as ambassador? Typically, it's a pro forma matter. In rare cases, the country will say no, but for the most part, they say, yeah, that's fine. Then you're nominated, then you have to go through the Senate confirmation process. And that's with Democrats and Republicans in the Senate. You go through meetings with the senators. And by the way, at the same time, you're going through consultations with every aspect of the United States government that touches on that country. So you're at the Pentagon, the State Department, the White House, the Treasury Department, the Commerce Department, on, the US Trade Rep's office, where you're learning about the current policies with regard to that country. And then that's almost like studying for the final exam being your confirmation hearing in the United States Senate when they start asking you questions. And then the Senate has its process and they have to vote on you out of committee, and then the Senate has to vote on you. So when you consider, I got nominated in the first week of June and confirmed the last week of January, and to post on August 15th, that was light speed for this process. So my guess is you may get lucky and have an ambassador in the late summer, but in all likelihood, it won't be until the fall, given just how long these processes take. And don't forget, it's not just ambassadors that have to get confirmed by the Senate. It's they're still confirming cabinet members, and then they have all the sub-cabinet members, and then they have the independent agency heads like the Securities and Exchange Commission or the Federal Communications Commission. Those guys all have to be, so it's like the pig going through the belly of the python, right? All those people have to get confirmed, and different committees hold different hearings, but it's typically a long process. I would hope that Ambassador to Germany would be fast-tracked a little bit more, but who knows? And there's 20 different ways that the whole thing can get slowed up. So I would say from an expectation standpoint, expect the fall, and maybe you'll get lucky and get somebody there earlier, the way Kimberly and I were able to arrive in the summer of 2013.
All right, then I think we should talk again in September and see where we are and if you were right. I want to ask one last question on this subject before we maybe move to the future, the Biden administration, and then also to questions from the audience is, once the new ambassador arrives, what do you think should be his or her first action in the job?
Well, it's interesting. People don't realize this, but you're actually not allowed to interact with government officials as a newly arriving ambassador until you have formally presented your credentials. And you do that to the head of state, not head of government. So in this case, it would be to President Steinmeier. And so when we arrived, we had about a week and a half before we could officially engage in government activities. And so during that period of time, obviously you get to know people in the embassy, and you're drinking from a fire hose, right? There are over 2,000 people in Mission Germany, 5 consulates, the pretty big embassy, so you're learning all your internal folks, you're getting briefed up and all that. But we went through our Jim Melville, who was the deputy chief of mission at the time, set up what we called wise men or wise people dinners and lunches. And Kimberly and I both participated in this. There's people like Wolfgang Ischinger, John Kornblum, Joe Jaffe from Die Zeit. So there were people from government, past government officials. Klaus Chariot, who had also, both Ischinger and Chariot had been ambassadors to the United States and for Germany. And so, we had these dinners, which was actually very helpful to be able to have very small, intimate, off the record discussions and get a real sense of perspective. So I would strongly advise whoever comes, to do that during that interim period. Then of course you need to immediately get around and meet the key people in the government, the key ministers in the government. That's a very early on process. And then I would say, don't wait too long before taking that 2 to 3 days a week to go to other parts in Germany. I mean, Germany has, as you all know, very discrete and independent media markets. The points of view you may get in Berlin are different from Schwerin, are different from Frankfurt, are different from Dusseldorf, are different from Stuttgart, are different from Munich, are different from Nuremberg, are different from Passau. So, all these places have, their sort of, independent press, independent business organizations, whatever. So to be able to at least go around and make that introductory level, and then to think very hard and seriously about, I probably worked harder on my opening speech, which I did the night I was presented my credentials and then could go public, if you will. Atlantic Brücke put together a big dinner for us, and I worked probably harder on that speech than just about any other speech I'd done in my life up until then, obviously, because I knew it was really important. And one of the things I wanted to do was, I always talked about the elephant in the room. And in this case, the elephant in the room was NSA. Handygate hadn't happened yet, but it was concern about the NSA. And so I addressed that very forthrightly, and that had an impact on people. So I would say that other piece of advice I would have is figure out, in part from your consultations and your wise people dinners or whatever, figure out what are the things people are most worried about and talk about them. That's a hugely important way to, I think, be effective and to build credibility and to really create a sense of your own honesty and forthrightness, which is an important part of trust building.
All right, thank you so much. So I wanted to move to, as I said, to what can we now expect from the Biden administration, because I'm sure you have a lot to say about that as well. And I already saw that we have one question that was actually pretty much what I wanted to ask. So I would like to start with this question from the audience. What do you believe the top 3 foreign policy goals of the Biden administration should be? And it goes on, how do you believe the administration is prepared to tackle these goals? And what do you think the largest obstacles will be for them?
I think and I wish I had his speech in front of me, because I'm sure you could divine it from that. But the first and most important foreign policy objective, which I think was the broader theme of his address at the State Department, is to rebuild our alliances and rebuild a much more of a collaborative relationship among and between our allies and the United States. You know, Tony Blinken in his confirmation hearing had a wonderful phrase. He said, "We will govern with confidence, but with humility." And the humility piece is really important. Guess what? We maybe don't have all the answers to all the problems in the world, and we certainly don't have the capability by ourselves of addressing all the challenges of the world. So I think rebuilding those relationships and alliances, that would be job number one. That was clearly something he stressed to the diplomatic corps. The second would be, I mean, President Biden talks about we're 4 crises that we're facing simultaneously in the United States. First is obviously the COVID crisis. Get on top of that, stop the spread of COVID, get people vaccinated. The second crisis is the economic crisis brought about by COVID, obviously, the economic shutdown and all that. Grow our economy and get that moving. The third crisis is climate and the climate change crisis. So I would say that is going to will be, sort of one of the top 3, whether it's 2 or 3 or 1, but one of the top 3, addressing climate change. So therefore, his first act on the first day of his presidency was to rejoin COP21, the Paris Climate Change Agreement, and to re-engage with our allies in that, to appoint John Kerry, who I think was a very highly regarded, particularly in Germany, Secretary of State, as his special envoy on climate. And believe me, you're going to be seeing a lot, those in Germany, I think you'll be seeing a lot of John Kerry over the course of the next 4 years. And so I think focusing on climate is going to be an absolute, top priority. And then third, it will be, and there are a lot of things that can be third. I think nuclear proliferation is an issue. It's why he's anxious to get back into the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. Iran has made now great strides since we pulled out of that agreement towards developing a nuclear weapon. We need to try to put that genie back in the bottle before it gets out. We backed out. The Trump administration withdrew from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement that Ronald Reagan, hardly a, kind of a left-wing pacifist type, that Ronald Reagan negotiated with Mikhail Gorbachev, with, his Secretary of State George Shultz and with Colin Powell. They negotiated that agreement, and the Trump administration pulled out of it. So I know that the Biden administration is working on nuclear proliferation in terms of trying to get started again or restarted with Vladimir Putin and with Russia. Obviously, focusing on China in that regard. And by the way, focusing on China with regard to climate change is going to be very important as well, and India as well. And then also looking at North Korea in terms of where they are. And so that would be a key issue. And also I do think, and again, to confine it to 3, and I apologize for not having, because my guess is he laid some of this out in the speech, but for not having that in front of me. But obviously dealing with the rise of China and dealing with it in a way where we are treating China as the competitor that they are, pushing them on issues like human rights violations, making sure that that perhaps we're checking military adventurism where we might see that, but fundamentally, and working to try to level the playing field when it comes to trade and trade negotiation, which is in all of our interests. It's in the United States' interest, it's in Germany's interest, it's in Europe's interest, Japan, et cetera. But that resetting the relationship with China in a way that is not going to be a huge departure from the Trump approach. The Trump approach recognizes that the days when we all thought, well, if we just engage with China, they'll become more like us and, abide by rule of law, et cetera. That's not likely to, the world is going in a different direction. China's moving in a different direction from that. So Trump administration recognized that. The Biden administration recognizes that. It was interesting that one of the last acts of the Trump administration was to declare China's treatment of the Uyghurs a genocide. And one of the first acts of Tony Blinken in his confirmation hearing to be Secretary of State was saying, yes, we agree, that is a genocide. So, I always say the difference between foreign policy will be a sharp distinction from what we had in the last 4 years. The difference on China will be a difference in degree, but not a difference in kind. We'll want to collaborate on things like climate, like nuclear nonproliferation, but we will continue to work hard to be competitive adversaries, I suppose you could say, with China, and making sure that we do everything we can to make sure they're playing by the rules that they agreed to when they joined the WTO, for instance. So maybe there are 4 things.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm actually sure that there are more. But we have limited time, so thank you for that. I think that since you now covered some of the goals, we somehow already started the Q&A part. And we have it's 10 to 8, so I think it's fine to go 2 questions from the audience. So if people at home want to ask questions, I see we already have some, but now it's the time. And they may go in different directions, but that's okay. So I will start by asking you this one maybe. Here are actually a couple of questions about German-American relations. So maybe that seems to be of interest to people. Here, people are asking, how much harm have the past 4 years done to American diplomacy and the German-American relations, and what can both sides do to improve these relations?
Well, has it done harm? Sure. Did that poll that I talked about, where 80% of Germans think that, think less of the United States, where Vladimir Putin and Russia is trusted as much as the United States. I mean, these are stunning numbers. And so obviously there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But I think it's really important for the German people to recognize there's a difference between the American government and the American people. And one thing that disturbed me was when we would hear friends say, we want to come and visit you in Los Angeles, but we're not going to travel to the United States during this administration. Because the administration's one thing, but the people-to-people ties are very deep and very profound and broadly based. There are over 65 million Americans with German roots. And I think one of the strongest and smartest things we did after the end of the Second World War was institute this whole series of exchange programs. I sit on the boards of 2 organizations that have them, the German Marshall Fund and the American Council on Germany. But think of the, pay. And, I must say it was hard. Kimberly and I rarely met anybody who was involved in the transatlantic relationship, whether it was in government or business or wonderful organizations such as the German-American Center, and who did not spend some time in the United States of America on an exchange program. They went to high school in places like Kansas, middle of the country. I mean, not just going to, New York, Washington, Los Angeles and San Francisco and Chicago, but I mean, all over and small town America, what have you. I think this is incredibly valuable. And we need to make sure that we, don't, regardless of whether you like or don't like the policies of administration, I think it's really important to continue to be engaged in one another's countries and, to travel there, to participate in exchange programs, to support organizations like this one that is hosting us here today, because that those people-to-people ties will allow folks to see beyond individual disputes we might have over things like Nord Stream or burden sharing when it comes to NATO spending and things like that, and see that there is a much broader and deeper relationship that needs to be, cultivated and invested in.
And I see that we have some teachers in the audience as well who were specifically interested in how do you get engaged in times like these where you can't travel? How do you, if you want to get involved in the transatlantic partnership, especially if you're a young person, how do you do that at the moment?
Like this. I mean, it's interesting there. I guarantee you, there are more people I see on my little screen, 313 participants right now. There are more people here than if I was there personally. If I was there personally, maybe you'd have 130, 140 people in a room. And this is something that I've discovered in doing a lot of these, both for my day job and for things like the American Council on Germany or German Marshall Fund, that where you get a much broader reach, with that. So with teachers in school, people such as myself, where I'm never going to be able to get into the classroom, or Kimberly, who does a lot of this kind of work as well, can never get into the classroom of all these different places. But if a teacher wanted to reach out and say, hey, we're going to have, a big session and the number of classes coming together, would you be willing to Zoom in and have a conversation? You can do that. I'm sure there are business leaders who would participate in that. I'm sure there are Germans who have great connections with the United States. Look at returning people who participated in young leaders programs or exchanges or whatever, have them either come into the classroom and again, since we can't travel, doing it electronically. So I actually hope in the post-COVID era, when we get to whatever the new steady state is, that it's more of a hybrid, because I think we can really take advantage of these kinds of technologies to better communicate and connect with one another than even what we were able to do with a lot of energetic plane and train and car travel.
All right, thanks so much. This is really good for us as well, because we now can invite people and experts from all over the world, and especially from the US, and it's much easier. So we have made this similar experience. So thank you for sharing that. I would like to move into the direction of military presence in Germany. That's an issue that's especially important to people here in Stuttgart. But we have a question from the audience. Do you consider the role and importance of the US military presence also a form of diplomacy?
Yeah, Kimberly and I spent a lot of time visiting our military bases and troops in Germany. Over 35,000 were positioned there. You have, of course, in Stuttgart, you have AFRICOM, you have EURCOM, and then we have USAR, U.S. Army Europe in Wiesbaden, and we have USAFE, U.S. Air Force Europe in Ramstein, and multiple other bases, Grafenwehr, Hohenfels, which are two of the largest training facilities anywhere in the world, and for American troops, and I mean for NATO troops as well, and German troops. And whenever I would go and speak, I said, look, I have the title, but you guys are the real ambassadors, because you're embedded in the communities. Your children are going to school with German children. They're playing on the same sports teams, things like that. And to a T, local elected officials with whom we met, mayors and city council people, whatever, were thrilled with the presence of American troops in their bases. And you know, people had no idea. We had an idea of the repercussions when, you know, Trump announced by tweet, in part, I think, in peak, because he was mad at Angela Merkel for, because of COVID, not traveling to his in-person G7 that he wanted to have earlier this or last year. So immediately said, we're going to move out 9,500 troops from Germany. First of all, those troops aren't there to protect Germany. Those troops are there to advance America's interests, particularly as we think about NATO missions, as we think about the need to have forward positioning, as we look at the Middle East or places like Afghanistan, Iraq, North Africa, et cetera. That is in America's national security interest. Sure, Germany benefits from it from an economic standpoint and from a security standpoint, but we benefit as well. And we also benefit from all the joint training exercises that we're allowed to do. So I'm a big believer that our troop presence in Germany, in Europe, helps to create and expand upon the diplomacy, more broadly put, of the United States. And just a word about diplomacy in the military. When the Trump administration wanted to slash diplomatic spending and move the money to the Pentagon, General Mattis, who was then Secretary Mattis, Donald Trump's first Secretary of Defense, said, if you do that, you're just going to have to buy me more bullets. Because in point of fact, our diplomats, our diplomacy is sort of the front line of protection. It prevents us from getting into situations where we may have to engage in kinetic warfare, where we may have to be firing those bullets. So I thought that was very interesting, is that the senior leaders of the military also understand the power of diplomacy. And let me tell you, every one of these combatant commanders who we would visit on the bases insisted that as part of our visit, we meet with the local mayors and city council people and elected folks, because that is such that kind of, person-to-person diplomacy with our hosts here in Germany is so important, not just to the diplomatic mission, but to the military mission as well.
And so President Biden has announced that he wanted to, put a halt on the withdrawal of the troops. But do you really think that this is it then? They are going to stay?
I think that obviously every president, takes a look at where our troops are deployed around the world, where the greatest challenges are, where the needs are to either build up forces or draw them down. Obviously, at the height of, the Cold War, we had 300,000 troops on the ground in Germany. Now we have 35,000. So there's already been a substantial drawdown. But it would only be done after a very thoughtful and deliberative process. And as regards, Germany and NATO, only then with strong consultation with our NATO allies. Now, I can't predict where that will come out, but I can also say it's very, very clear that the Biden administration has deep and abiding commitment to NATO, to strengthening NATO, and recognizes that NATO has a far broader role than the more focused role that it had during the Cold War. And on a personal level, and this is not to speak for the Biden administration, which I have absolutely no knowledge of where they could be on this, I would be surprised to see that kind of a drawdown, and certainly not for the reason that the Trump administration said, because Germany wasn't paying enough for NATO. By the way, it's going to cost us money. They were moving troops to Italy and to Belgium. Germany pays more than either of those places to NATO. So, I mean, it just made no sense on a whole host of levels. So I think that kind of approach is off the table and will be much more replaced by a more thoughtful approach about our deployments globally. And that approach will also engage, particularly when we're talking about Europe and a NATO member, close collaboration and consultation with our allies.
All right, thanks. We are moving, as it seems, more toward foreign policy again. And the question here was, what kind of policy can we expect in terms of relationship towards Russia from the side of the US?
Well, I think we had an indication of that in the readout on President Biden's first conversation with Vladimir Putin, where he, talked about areas that they could work together and cooperate, but also confronted him on a number of areas in which the previous administration has remained silent. And so I think it will be a very direct and candid relationship, and perhaps a forceful one in certain areas. I think Vladimir Putin respects strength. I'm not sure he would have, and obviously I have no idea what he's thinking, but I'm not sure objectively, looking at the way we were dealing with him on some of these tough issues, like the allegation that Russia was paying bounty to the Taliban to kill American soldiers, to never even raise that, with Putin, and it never was raised by the predecessor president with Putin. I mean, if I'm Putin, I'm thinking that's a sign of weakness, not a sign of strength. So I think you're going to see perhaps a much more balanced relationship there. And Navalny, this poisoning of this leader, and now the imprisonment of this leader, that's going to have consequences. Continued behavior in Ukraine, that's going to have consequences. And so I think that we'll see, the one thing that I would imagine out of a Biden administration is there'll be a much more predictive kind of foreign policy. In other words, it won't be everybody wakes up at 5 a.m. to see what was tweeted. There'll be a process. There'll be pretty strong statements about what we stand for, what our red lines are, what we're willing to engage in, what we're not. There will be it'll be a much steadier and more predictive foreign policy that we'll see as it relates to Russia, and I think also as it relates to China. The one thing on China, I think it's important. There are lots of discussions in Germany about, do we want to go the American way on China, or should we just go on our own? We just had the EU negotiated its investment agreement with China in the waning days of the Trump administration. I think that it's important, even including for people in the business community, to take a look at, okay, it's a new day now. We have a new administration in there. And really ask yourself the question, are we going to get a better deal with China in terms of playing by the rules, respecting intellectual property rights and IP, all those kinds of things, if we go on our own as a German company, as Germany, as Europe, or if we go and bring pressure jointly with the United States, bringing those two big markets to bear? And I think that's an important question, because now there's a willingness and a desire to do it that way. And so I think that's a question that, the German businesses in particular, and politicians and others who are sort of resistant at the idea of collaborating with the United States vis-a-vis China, need to ask themselves. Doesn't mean we have to do everything identically, but it's something that needs to be asked.
Okay, speaking of China, there's one other question here related to that subject. Would you say that the US should take a more active stance in supporting Taiwan in order to prevent a possible mainland Chinese invasion?
Well, I think, the US has been very supportive of Taiwan, in terms of military support and weapons sales and all that. We do have the one China policy. I mean, it's, we don't recognize Taiwan as a separate country or entity, but there's, I think that, and this is not an area of my expertise, but I would just say intuitively, China tends to be a country that thinks in decades and centuries and not years, and certainly not election cycles like, unfortunately, we sometimes seem to do. I can't imagine why engaging in a military conflict or kinetic military action against Taiwan at this point would be in China's interest. Do they really want to be an occupying power? Do they really want to shut that down? I just don't see how that would be in their self-interest. And I, perhaps, in conversations, and by the way, I think they'll see a restoration of multiple levels of communication between the U.S. and China, some of which I think had sort of evaporated during the last 4 years. That may be a topic for discussion. I mean, certainly any kind of action like that would be met with massive sanctions, economic sanctions globally, that would be, very damaging for China and the Chinese economy. And it just, do they really want to be an occupying power of Taiwan? If you think in decades, you think in centuries, the world may change, but to try to force that change in the short term, I'm just not so sure whether it's in their economic or military or any other interest. So, and maybe it's incumbent upon the West to make that case that it's not in their interest.
All right. I'm very surprised that we get to so many questions, and there are more. We have a question related to what your opinion is regarding a comeback of Donald Trump, how this could be prevented, given the frictions not only across the US population, but also within the Republican Party. So very different area, but.
Well, look, I always used to say a month is a lifetime in American politics. 2.5, 3, 4 years is like a century in American politics. So the idea of speculating now on a comeback of Donald Trump or not is it's sort of it's fun to do over a beer, but it's I don't think it's going to provide any real answers. I do think this. I think the Republican Party in our country is in the midst of a big internal struggle. Are they the party of Trump? As Ben Sasse, who's the very conservative senator, Republican senator from Nebraska, said earlier this week, I don't think the idea of a party that's devoted to, that is committed to singular devotion to a dude, meaning Donald Trump, that's not what the Republican Party is all about. So you have one group that's it's whatever Trump is the guy. He's my guy. We're just devoted to him. And that's a pretty significant part now of Republican primary voters. And then you have more what I consider the mainstream Republican Party. And we're beginning to see senators like not just Ben Sasse, but others and Liz Cheney, the number 3 person in the House of Representatives who at great political risk in terms of her own career actually voted to impeach Donald Trump, Republican leader, who are saying, no, that's not what our party is about. That's not what we're about. We need to return to our basic core principles and not be some personality cult devoted to Donald Trump. This is a huge fight that internally the Republican Party is struggling with. And the challenge that, we have is right now, Donald Trump still has a hold on an appeal to a significant block of voters that might constitute as much as 60% of Republican primary voters. So there's this, if you are a senator, or a member of Congress, or a governor, and you dare cross Donald Trump, is he going to run somebody who's much more Trumpian in a primary against you and beat you in that primary? And interestingly enough, in a lot of places, if he does that, it means the Democrat's ultimately going to win that seat. Because if you have more of a moderate Democrat and a very far, extreme Republican who knocked off a more moderate Republican because they had the temerity to challenge something that Donald Trump said, they may end up losing that general election. So the Republican Party's got some real challenges on its hands, and it's unclear to me how that will ultimately resolve itself. But, my guess is if you were to put most Republicans, including people that view themselves as big Trump supporters, but they're thinking of running for president, if you were to put them under truth serum, sodium pentothal, or whatever it is, they would just say, I wish that guy would just go away. But that isn't likely to happen. I do think he's going to have a lot of economic challenges with his businesses and maybe even legal challenges, not, from the Biden Justice Department, but from, the Southern District of New York and other places that are looking into some of his previous business dealings, that he may have his hands full. But I think the more interesting question is this sort of challenge that the Republican Party has as to, which way do you go? And I don't think that's going to be resolved anytime soon.
All right. We had a couple of events already this year, and a lot of people always were interested about, where do we go from here and what's going to happen to the Republican Party. So we will, have to keep talking about this also. And maybe one other question in this direction from another guest here. Many Trump supporters may still cling to the idea that America should not focus so much on foreign policies. What would you tell them why transatlantic relationship matters? Maybe more than ever.
I'd say look at COVID. By the way, one other area I neglected to mention when I talked about these global issues that you can't address your own are pandemics. I don't think anybody thinks it's going to be another 100 years before we have a viral pandemic like the one we're dealing with now that we dealt with in the Spanish flu. I mean, just in the last 10 years, we had to deal with the SARS outbreak. We had to deal with Ebola. That came up during my time as ambassador. And in fact, Germany and the United States worked very closely together in addressing that. So what I would tell people is, if you think about the big challenges that we face, they are invariably challenges that are best addressed by a number of nations collaborating together, number one. Number two, if you think about our security, the plans for 9/11 and the 9/11 attacks, those didn't come from inner city New York. They came from overseas. And if you're not engaged globally, you're just not even going to pick this stuff up. You're not going to have a sense of what's brewing, how to best, protect ourselves. So there's national security implications to that. And then finally, there's a moral argument, that we have a duty and a responsibility to try to, be a leader, not necessarily the leader, but a leader in helping, to deal with moral challenges as they arise, human rights violations, refugee crises, these kinds of things, and that's another reason why it's important for us to be engaged overseas. So I think you can make self-interest arguments, and you can make economic self-interest arguments, national security self-interest arguments, big picture, global challenge self-interest arguments like climate change, nuclear proliferation, controlling a future pandemic. But you can also make moral arguments as to why it's important.
Okay, here we have a question. Chancellor Merkel and President Macron recently spoke of building a European sovereignty. Does that come across as an affront to the US?
Oh, no, not at all. I think, honestly, I believe that it's in the America's national security interest for there to be a strong and independent Europe. And, the whole issue of burden sharing and Europe playing a more of a leading role in addressing global issues, that's something I talked about as ambassador. That was one of our objectives. We used to call it Global Germany. We wanted Germany to step out and play a leading role. It's one reason why we were so excited when we heard President Gauck's extraordinary speech on the, Tage Deutsche Einheit in 2013, where he talked about we aren't just an island out there. We need to engage more globally. So the idea of a strong Europe is very much in our interest. So I don't see that as a threat at all. I see that as something very natural. Look, Europe's got to the EU at least got to reconstitute itself now with the UK out because of Brexit. And I think it makes a lot of sense. It's not like they're unifying to go against the United States. 99 out of 100 issues are going to be things we can work on together. So I see it as a positive.
All right. And in that way, you already covered a lot of other questions that we are receiving regarding, where do you see Europe and all of this, and what role should Europe play in this partnership? So I'm jumping here. I'm moving back to domestic policies, I guess. Do you think that President Biden will be able to bridge the divide between Republican and Democrats in your country?
Well, it's I mean, there are really two aspects to this. I think a lot of people confuse unity with getting bipartisan legislation through Congress. Unity is much broader than that. Unity is about tone. It's about pursuing policies that are going to benefit different parts of America, regardless of whether there are places that supported him or not. Some of what he's trying to do to help bring resources to rural America, for instance, is an example of that. I mean, it's pretty clear you have an urban-rural divide, and blue urban areas tend to be bluer, the rural areas tend to be redder. Making clear in his tone, in his statements, in his policies, that he is really trying to govern for all Americans, not engaging in kind of the partisan political warfare that we see. I found it interesting that in two issues that came up right at the outset of his presidency. One was whether, with the Democrats controlling 50+1 of the Senate, getting rid of the filibuster, which would say that on a party line basis, you can jam through all kinds of legislation. You can already do that with this budget reconciliation process, which is what they're working on now, which is what Trump used to get his tax cut through and Bush used to get his tax cut through. That requires 50 votes, but everything else, you've really got to get 60 votes in the Senate. So it's a push towards bipartisanship. There was a lot of push from the progressive community. The Democrats ought to get rid of that. Biden stayed out of that. He said, well, and in fact, he even indicated during the campaign he wasn't necessarily in favor of that. On the impeachment, how would you vote? Would you vote to convict, Donald Trump? And, Biden said, look, I ran against him in part because I thought he was unfit to be president, but I'm not going to engage in that. I got a lot to do right now. I'm trying to fill my government. I'm trying to deal with COVID, get our economy started again. That's what I'm going to focus on. So I think when you look at tone, approach, pursuing of policies that are going to be, effective across the board and maybe even specifically helpful in parts of the country that were voted for Donald Trump rather than Joe Biden, I think he can do that. In terms of bipartisan legislation, I think a lot of the legislation, even things that he pursues on a 50-vote basis, he will get bipartisan support for. I don't know if he gets to 60 votes in the Senate, but a lot of that depends on how strictly the Republicans want to engage or adopt the policy that they adopted during Barack Obama's time, which is we're just going to try to oppose everything. What I'm encouraged by is the appointments process to date. Several of his cabinet members that have to go through Senate confirmation were confirmed in the Obama administration for different jobs, like Janet Yellen, who is confirmed as chair of the Federal Reserve Board, and Tony Blinken, who was confirmed as Deputy Secretary of State. There were, in both cases, about a dozen Republican senators who had voted against them during the Obama year who voted for them this time. And it doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily endorse all their policies, but what it does suggest to me is that a little bit of a softening of that idea that we're going to have a harsh party line opposition to anything that the Biden administration, pursues. But I think, so let's hope we have more bipartisanship in our legislation. But I think it's important not to confuse the lack of that, which often can be tied to just political calculation on the elected officials' part, with a lack of unity. Because unity is going to be much more about the messaging and the tone and the kind of presidency that he establishes.
Right, but
it'll be hard. It'll be hard because we are a divided country, and I want to remind people, 5 out of our last 6 presidential elections have been incredibly close, and in 2 of them, the loser of the popular vote, won the electoral college. And back in 2004, when John Kerry ran against George W. Bush, Bush won by 3 million votes. But if Kerry had flipped 60,000 votes in the state of Ohio, he would have been president. And the Romney Obama reelect in 2012 was a very close election. So we are a divided country politically. But what I found interesting was states like Georgia, Arizona, this last time that seemed to switch. I'm not going to say they're blue states; they're more purple states at this point. But I do think there's unquestionably the Biden message about trying to unify the country. That's something people want.
And do you think that of all the candidates that were there, that Biden is the one who's most likely to bring unity back to the country?
Well, that would be a question for the primary process. Now we're through there, and I think, look, the thing about Joe Biden, a lot of the Trump support comes from, working class folks from the middle of the country. That's Joe Biden. He grew up as a working class kid from Scranton, Pennsylvania. So he understands viscerally sort of the challenges that people have. He understands what it means to have your dad come home and look you in the eye and say, I lost my job today. Because that happened to him, when he was growing up. So there's an ability that he has to connect with people that, maybe it was harder for even Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama to connect with. So that's number one. Bill Clinton could connect, and Ronald Reagan on the other side was able to connect. But I think that's point number one. Point number two is, in all his years in the Senate, one thing Democrats or Republicans could agree on was they liked Joe Biden. He was a decent human being who cared about them, who would listen to their points of view, maybe not agree, maybe not go along with them at the end of the day, but they always felt that he heard them. And that's something else that he brings to the table, which is terrific. So I think that, very much he is the right man for the right time as president of the United States.
That is a very positive outlook. And we have, time is running, we have 6 more minutes left. And we have a question that is more tailored to you again. And your person, have you ever found it difficult to represent the United States abroad?
There's a reason why sometimes when a new administration comes in, you see people resign. One of them is, in my case, you're a political appointee, and so you have to step aside, and they'll fire you if you don't. I suppose they could. But another reason is because of the values that you represent. So, look, I worked for 2 presidents that I believed in, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. There may have been particular policies that I disagreed with or would have maybe come down in a different direction. But I never had a moral or ethical problem representing them, representing the administration of the United States overseas. I think that, there was never a situation where I can't believe I have to go out and advocate for this because it's, ridiculous. I mean, I never, so I was very lucky in that regard. And part of it is because of the people that I, work for and represented. I mean, I could see that happening, and sometimes that does happen, and sometimes people resign on principle. We saw a little bit of that finally at the end of the Trump administration. We saw that during the Nixon years. We saw that during Bill Clinton's administration. There was a high-level person in the Justice Department in Health and Human Services when Clinton put through his welfare reform packages, which required, work for welfare, and also required the government to provide jobs for that purpose. There was a progressive who he'd appointed there who resigned on principle because that policy would have to be enacted through his department and his responsibility. He didn't feel in good conscience he could do that. So, I mean, it happens on both sides, but I've never been in that situation.
All right. And before I hand it back to Christiane, because there's one question that we really wanted to ask you before she can wrap up the session, is that if you had one wish with regards to the future of the transatlantic partnership, what would that be? And maybe you can also elaborate a little bit about why.
Well, I think it would be that regardless of differences that we may have in government policies, that on the people-to-people levels, we continue to broaden and deepen our relationships and our ties. And, I talked a little bit about that before in terms of whether it's exchange programs or travel or engaging people from the other country who happen to be where you are, whether it's work or neighborhood or what have you. Because I think fundamentally that is what really leads to a strong and cohesive long-term relationship. And why? Because I honestly believe we do share the same values. I think we have many of the same interests, and I also think just on a interpersonal level, it's more rewarding. It's much more rewarding to be engaging with people from different cultures and perspectives than it is just talking to people all day long who think the way you do. It's one of the problems I have with social media. I noticed there was a question on social media in there, which is that, the social media algorithms are designed to keep feeding you stuff that you like, or you already agree on. So after a period of time, you're not seeing a balanced perspective on social media. And that leads to a siloization where people are only getting one point of view. And that's what in part can lead to people pulling apart and not talking to each other, talking past one another, ultimately having alternative facts, which I don't buy that because I don't think there are alternative, but that's kind of what happened. And so I think that that the interpersonal people-to-people engagement is what helps break through that siloization that unfortunately the technology in our culture is pushing us harder and harder towards.
Right, thanks, especially for this, because this is exactly what we are doing, talking to one another across the Atlantic, and it's so helpful and so wonderful, and so thank you very much for all your insight. I would like to hand it back to Christiane, but just wanted to say a quick thank you to you for taking the time, and to all the people who asked so many wonderful questions. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Marianne. Thank you, Christiana. And for sure, thank all of you for joining in and participating with us, and for the many, many, many of you who hung on for the full hour and a half. Cheers.
Yeah, thank you so very much, Mr. Ambassador and Marion. And Ambassador Emerson, that was really a great insight into the field of diplomatic work. Thank you also for sharing your personal experiences and your memories. And of course, for the assessments and outlooks on the further domestic and foreign policy developments of the US and the transatlantic relations. It was so inspiring, and I think not only I learned a lot, so thank you again. And by the way, thank you also for addressing more than one elephant in the room. When it comes to these elephants, well, I have the impression that the transatlantic area seems to be pretty crowded at this moment. But fortunately, it now looks as if we will be able to talk and to work together better in the future. Germans, Americans, Europeans, and the rest of the world. But it has to be a joint effort. And also we Germans, if I may say so, will not be able to just sit back and wait for the impetus coming from Washington or from the US Embassy in Berlin. Yeah, we have to share. Yeah. So once again, I would like to thank you very much, Ambassador Emerson. I certainly hope that we will soon be able to meet again in person. I would be very, very pleased. Thank you. I also like to thank our listeners and questioners for their participation, and also my colleagues from the cooperating German-American centers, and my colleague at the DAC Stuttgart, my colleague Katrin Büttner, for her technical support. Thanks, Katrin. And so finally, a little bit of event publicity. That has to be just, I have to do that now. So forgive me. On February 23rd, there will be an event on the state partnership, Baden-Württemberg, California, with the other German-American centers in Baden-Württemberg. And this time hosted by the German-American Center Heidelberg on the topic Higher Education Strategies for Innovation at Stanford and Heidelberg University. The following day, on February 24th, the German-American Center in Stuttgart, in cooperation with the US Embassy Berlin and the US Consulates Germany, will host a roundtable discussion during Black History Month on the topic, The Road Ahead, Working Towards Racial Justice and Equality. So that brings hope, I hope. A warm invitation to all of you. And if you want to learn more about the German-American Center in Stuttgart and all the other cooperation partners, just check out our websites and the other social media outlets. So finally, may I wish you all a wonderful evening. Stay healthy. Goodbye, Ambassador Emerson. Say hi to Kimberly, please. And good night, everybody. Goodbye.